Doug Wyllie with Police Magazine, Coffee with Police Experts, the 2022 ILEETA series. We're here with Don Moore with SBCM Protection Consultants.
Correct.
Don, you are here at ILEETA in St. Louis teaching an interesting class, and I saw that on the agenda. I immediately reached out to you, the commandments of training. And we've talked a little bit offline about this, but can you expound upon, what are those tips and tricks that you give to instructors? Because there's so many instructors whose message gets muddied with maybe, let's just say, less than optimal teaching methodology, correct?
Absolutely. So we all started out at the same, and over the years I've come across the best practices that I found works best for me. I started out not knowing what I was doing, standing in front of an academy class trying to give a speech for one of our presentations, and it just wasn't coming out. Mm-hmm. And now today I consider myself to be a pretty good instructor. I get a lot of good reviews, and I've been taking tips and different aspects of other instructors incorporating into what I do.
Yeah. So Don, you were saying, a lot of times we see law enforcement trainers, and frankly trainers in a variety of different enterprises, whether it's in the public safety sectors or in the private sector, who are really, it's an annual or semi-annual, check the box type of training. We want to make sure that, this form has been filled out, HR has that, we've got records of this has been done, but we don't necessarily keep track of how well it's been done and whether or not it's incorporated into that student's actual work. How is it that you and what it is you teach helps effectively change that behavior in law enforcement training?
Well, first we look at the mindset of the audience. We look at how the learning process takes place, how the teaching process takes place. The sage on a stage with a lecture used to be the way to go, but it's not anymore. Sometimes it is. When you're giving a legal update, there's only so much you can do to include the audience. But we have to stimulate the brain, because we all have heard about the wizard brain, the lizard brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is our thinking part of the brain, the cognitive brain, and our limbic system, especially in law enforcement, because we can give you all the best tools in the world, we can give you all the training in the world, but if we don't teach you how to keep that lizard brain in check, bad things happen, and that's what we've been seeing. And it's not the officer, it's not making an excuse for the behavior, but it's explaining it. It goes back to how we train the officer.
Yeah.
For example, in use of force, I've been a policeman for 35 years, and I've only heard one other instructor my entire career say that we're really good about getting you up here if you have to use your firearm, but once you pull that gun out, we don't teach you what to do with the gun. We simply tell you to put it back.
Yeah.
But we don't teach you how to put it back, and that's where we see these controversial shootings or high-profile shootings.
So, and we were talking a little bit before we started to roll the camera here about things like slip and capture and things that are common vernacular in law enforcement training, but maybe not necessarily something that is adequately, sufficiently covered. How is it that you and the folks that you work with, how are you remediating that?
Well, what we see is it's called continuity association. It's associating things. For example, if I see a fork on a table, my brain tells me I should be seeing a spoon and a table knife with it at place setting. So it picks out what it thinks should be happening. We send officers, for example, to firearms training all the time because that's a high liability, high ticket item. Yeah. But when it comes to taser training, for example, we go through a half-hour training every year, fire 2 darts at a static target, right, and that's it, put the taser away. But we don't incorporate it into our firearms training or high stress. So that when the brain goes through a high stress situation, it's going to rely on what it knows the best. Mm-hmm. And in a stress situation, for example, the recent Brooklyn Center shooting, looking at the video, now not knowing all the background, but looking at the video, there was a lot of high stress for some reason, mm-hmm, on the part of the officer. She actually thought she had a taser in her hand, and she ended up having a firearm in her hand. And that's happened about 15 times so far in the United States. Yeah. And that goes right back to training the brain on how to slow down, how to pick the right files. It's like a computer system.
Mm-hmm. Right. You've also talked a little bit about incorporating some of the best practices in terms of teaching and understanding the learning styles of the adult learner, and understanding that there are different adult learners in every classroom. Say, for example, if you have 30 people in your classroom, you're going to have one-third, one-third, and one-third of 3 different types of learning styles. And there are people who have done training outside of law enforcement that you've taken, for example, Stephen Covey. Some of the best practices of communicating and engaging people. How is it you, for example, with Covey, how do you incorporate that into the work that you do?
Again, like you said, you got to know your audience, and the audience is always changing. But for example, Stephen Covey's 7 effective habits, or
Yeah.
7 habits of
Seven
effective
habits of
people.
effective people.
That's something that's universal. That's actually taught in elementary schools. My youngest was learning that years ago when we were teaching in high schools and university levels too.
Yeah.
And as a trainer, as an instructor, we're also taking the role of a leader on, and we have to apply leadership techniques and traits in the transformational and transformative training that we're doing. We have to make that audience feel like they're a part of the training, not simply receiving the training.
Yeah, and that is, a lot of that is interactive, is extracting answers in ways that, for example, you're giving, instead of giving the answers, you're giving the questions, right?
Correct.
And so you force the audience, you force the learners into active engagement, active participation in the learning process. For someone who, if you're doing this work in a defensive tactics class, you're in the mat room, you are obviously in an interactive environment. In a classroom, it's a little more difficult. How would you take some of the way in which you would do DT on the mat? You're getting sweaty and getting physical. How would you take some of the ways in which that learning is done and put it into a classroom?
Well, one of the things I actually do when it's in a classroom is it makes people feel uncomfortable, but when you go hide in the back of the classroom, I'm going to focus on you, I'm going to focus on the person in the front. But when I have a topic I'm talking about, for example, we talk about grain versus counter.
Yeah.
First off, I ask people, do you know what the 3-prong test is? And I tell them, I put a little humor in it, if you think it's the fork at KOA that you put chocolate and a marshmallow on, you're going to get sued and end up in jail. And I will go around and ask people, I will point them out in class and say, can you tell me about this? Or what do you think about this? Or what are we doing? That forces the person to engage. While it's uncomfortable, it's also a learning process because now everybody's paying attention because the next person doesn't want to be caught off guard saying, oh, here comes Don, he's going to pick on me to engagement.
Yeah, one of the things that I really appreciate about ILEETA in general and specifically about trainers such as yourself is the best law enforcement trainers are also constantly learners. And so I really appreciate some of the things that you told us today, taking the time to do that. And I really appreciate the things you're going forward doing with our law enforcement brothers and sisters out there.
I appreciate that very much because it's really important that one thing is for instructors too, and that's one of the part of the points, is seek to understand and then you can be understood. And I've taken some concepts, I've asked students in class, for example, we were trying to explain how to take action as a police officer or security officer. And this guy came up, need to act versus want to act. I'm like, I got to take that from you because that explains it, the need to act versus want to act. So it's something we put into the class. My class today is not going to be the same tomorrow because there's going to be something different from your class.
Fantastic.
So that's crucial.
Fantastic. Don, thank you again for your time.
I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Once again, Doug Wyllie with Police Magazine. Coffee with Police Experts will be back.